September 14th, 1952, 7:42 hours, over the frozen skies of East Germany. The decision was made inside a single-seat cockpit at 29,000 feet, sealed beneath a canopy glazed with ice. Lieutenant Lewis Curtis sat alone in the F-86, oxygen mask tight against his face, hands steady on the controls. The radar scope had already done its work. A fast-moving contact approached from the east, speed and altitude consistent with a hostile interceptor. Ground control confirmed the classification without hesitation. Soviet aircraft. Intercept authorized. Curtis acknowledged the order with a clipped transmission. His voice carried no inflection. The engagement sequence unfolded exactly as trained. Throttle forward. Nose adjusted. Closure rate calculated. The target filled the forward arc of the canopy, a silver shape against the pale sky. Identification markers became visible as the distance collapsed. This was the moment doctrine existed for. There was no ambiguity in the order. Any unauthorized aircraft crossing into the corridor was to be destroyed. The command had been issued minutes earlier by officers hundreds of miles away, sitting beneath fluorescent lights, tracking blips on a map. Curtis was the final link in that chain. As the aircraft rolled slightly to align the firing solution, Curtis registered the marking on the enemy fuselage. A personal insignia, distinctive, unmistakable. He had seen it before, not in combat, but in another context entirely. The recognition was immediate and absolute. The opposing pilot was Svetlana Valeria. No protocol addressed recognition. No checklist covered memory. The radio continued to murmur with procedural confirmations, but Curtis no longer processed the words. The cockpit narrowed to a single choice, compressed into seconds. Fire or do not fire. He did not request clarification. He did not break radio silence. He did not maneuver away. Any deviation would have been visible to controllers and recorded without interpretation. Hesitation itself was an act. Curtis centered the target. The firing solution stabilized. The decision was no longer theoretical. It was mechanical, final, irreversible. At 7:43 hours, Lewis Curtis squeezed the trigger. The aircraft responded instantly, systems executing what had been designed and authorized long before either pilot entered the sky. The decision, made in that cockpit, concluded not with deliberation, but with action. The opportunity existed because every variable that mattered had already been resolved in Curtis' favor before the aircraft ever crossed paths. At that moment over East Germany, the air war was governed by predictability rather than chaos. This was not a swirling dogfight or an improvised encounter. It was a controlled intercept inside a tightly managed air corridor, one shaped by radar coverage, predefined engagement zones, and rigid rules of response. Curtis was flying an aircraft designed specifically for this environment. The F-86 Sabre held advantages that were not theoretical. They were measurable, rehearsed, and repeatedly validated in training and prior encounters. Altitude belonged to him. Speed belonged to him. Radar awareness belonged to him. The engagement geometry was clean. The target approached along a vector dictated by mission planning rather than tactical creativity. Soviet patrol routes in the sector were well studied, their timing predictable, their profiles familiar to NATO controllers who watched the same corridors day after day. Curtis did not need to search for the enemy. The enemy had already been delivered into his field of control. From a purely military standpoint, interception was inevitable once the boundary was crossed. Ground radar stations tracked the MiG long before Curtis could see it with his own eyes. Course, speed, and altitude were relayed continuously, reducing uncertainty to almost nothing. Curtis' task was not to discover or improvise, but to execute. The aircraft systems simplified the process further. Lock-on times were short. Firing envelopes were generous. The Sabre could dictate the engagement without forcing the pilot into extreme maneuvering or risk. The MiG-15, though formidable in capable hands, entered the encounter at a structural disadvantage. It lacked comparable situational awareness. Its pilot relied on eyesight, instinct, and limited ground guidance rather than a fused picture of the battle space. Once Curtis moved into position, The MiG's options narrowed rapidly. Turning hard would bleed energy. Diving would surrender altitude. Continuing straight would preserve the firing solution. None of those choices altered the fundamental imbalance. There were no complicating factors. Weather was stable. Visibility was sufficient. No additional contacts cluttered the airspace. No friendly aircraft threatened misidentification. No electronic interference degraded tracking. This was not a marginal engagement balanced on luck. It was an almost clinical scenario, the kind instructors used as an example of ideal interception conditions. Curtiss training existed precisely for moments like this. The doctrine emphasized that opportunity in air combat was fleeting, but here it was unusually persistent. The target's approach path, speed, and lack of support meant the window did not collapse immediately. Curtiss had time measured not in heartbeats, but in long seconds. Enough time to maneuver deliberately. Enough time to confirm identity. Enough time to fire with confidence. From command's perspective, this was the optimal outcome. A single interceptor neutralizing a lone intruder without escalation, without loss, without uncertainty. The engagement promised a clean operational report and reinforced the credibility of airspace control. Every successful intercept strengthened deterrence. Every failure invited probing and pressure. That logic framed every instruction Curtiss had ever received. The opportunity, therefore, was not abstract. It was concrete, actionable, and aligned perfectly with established military logic. Curtiss could execute his orders with minimal risk to himself, high probability of success, and no foreseeable operational downside. The systems worked. The doctrine fit. The enemy's position made resistance unlikely to change the result. Nothing in the tactical situation argued for restraint. Nothing in the military calculus suggested delay. Every factor that planners hoped for when authorizing interception was present simultaneously. Only one variable remained unresolved, and it was not a military one. Curtiss' assessment did not begin in the sky. It had been formed long before the intercept, shaped by a system that demanded anticipation rather than reaction. In the hours before takeoff, his preparation followed a pattern designed to eliminate surprise. Flight paths were reviewed until they required no conscious recall. Engagement corridors were memorized not as lines on a map, but as spatial relationships between altitude, speed, and response time. Curtiss did not expect to improvise. He expected the encounter to unfold within parameters already defined. Intelligence briefings reinforced that expectation. Soviet patrol behavior in the sector was consistent, almost habitual. Routes repeated. Timings drifted only within narrow margins. Curtiss absorbed these details without commentary, integrating them into an internal model of how the engagement would likely present itself. His task was not to outthink the enemy, but to recognize when the model matched reality and act accordingly. The aircraft itself demanded the same mindset. Systems checks were methodical, not rushed. Radar calibration, weapon status, fuel management, and emergency procedures were verified in sequence. Each step existed to reduce the number of decisions required later. In Curtiss training, hesitation was treated as a systems failure, not a moral one. The fewer choices left to the pilot in combat, the greater the likelihood of mission success. Psychological readiness was addressed indirectly. Curtiss had been conditioned to treat identity as irrelevant once a target was confirmed hostile. Training exercises deliberately removed personal context, emphasizing symbols, signatures, and classifications instead of people. The doctrine assumed that emotional distance was both possible and necessary. Curtiss accepted that assumption as part of his profession. Previous encounters reinforced the lesson. Cold War airspace was not an abstract concept to him. It was a place where recognition flashes came and went without consequence because protocol intervened before thought could. He had already learned to suppress curiosity, to reduce the opposing aircraft to a problem of geometry and timing. That suppression was not accidental. It was practiced. By the time Curtiss entered the patrol zone, his internal checklist was complete. He knew what he would do if the target turned. He knew what he would do if it dove. He knew what he would do if ground control lost contact. None of those contingencies required debate. They required execution. What Curtis did not prepare for, because no system acknowledged it, was the collision between procedural certainty and personal recognition. His foresight covered fuel states, missile reliability, and engagement envelopes. It did not extend to memory. The manuals did not account for familiarity. The simulations did not include names or faces. From an institutional perspective, Curtis was prepared exactly as intended. His readiness was not measured by flexibility, but by compliance. The Air Force did not need him to decide whether to act. It needed him to act when the criteria were met. By the time the intercept began, Curtis' preparation had already done its work. His hands moved without instruction. His aircraft moved without hesitation. The assessment phase was over before he consciously registered it. What remained was not a question of capability or foresight. It was the collision of preparation with something it had been designed to exclude. The moment Curtis recognized the pilot, the decision was already being taken away from him. The structure governing the engagement did not exist to accommodate judgment. It existed to prevent it. Every instruction Curtis had received, every rule that defined the air war over Germany, was designed to compress choice into obedience. The overrule was not issued in that instant. It had been issued years earlier, embedded into doctrine, command authority, and political necessity. The Cold War airspace regime tolerated no ambiguity. Each crossing of the corridor was treated not as an individual act, but as a signal within a larger strategic contest. NATO command viewed every intrusion as a probe, every hesitation as a precedent. The fear was not loss of an aircraft, but erosion of credibility. If an interceptor failed to engage, the meaning would be interpreted far beyond the cockpit. It would be read in Moscow, in Allied capitals, and in the calculations of planners who believed deterrence depended on consistency without exception. Curtis was not empowered to weigh context. The chain of command ran in only one direction. Orders descended, execution followed. Any attempt to introduce personal factors into the engagement would have required explanation, justification, and delay. Delay itself was unacceptable. In the logic of the system, hesitation equaled vulnerability. Institutional pressure reinforced this rigidity. Pilots were acutely aware that engagements were monitored, recorded, and reviewed. Radar logs, radio transcripts, and after-action reports created a permanent record. Deviations did not disappear. They accumulated. One unexplained anomaly could end a career. Two could invite suspicion of loyalty. In a conflict defined by ideology, suspicion was not a temporary condition. Curtis' superiors did not know Svetlana Valeria. They did not need to. The system assumed that pilots were interchangeable operators executing standardized responses. The human element was deliberately minimized to reduce risk. Curtis' recognition was irrelevant to command because it was unknowable to command. The institution could not respond to information it did not recognize as valid. Political leadership amplified this constraint. Airspace enforcement was not merely tactical. It was symbolic. Each successful intercept affirmed alliance resolve. Each failed intercept risked public embarrassment or diplomatic escalation. The leadership that issued the standing orders did so under pressure from allied governments demanding reassurance and from domestic audiences conditioned to equate firmness with safety. The language of those orders reflected that anxiety. Engage all hostile aircraft. No exceptions. The phrasing was intentional. It eliminated discretion. Curtis was not being asked to decide whether force was justified. That decision had already been made collectively, abstractly, and far from the sky. Even the communication structure prevented intervention. Curtis could not pause the engagement to explain recognition. There was no channel for confession, no protocol for exemption. To speak would have been to break radio discipline during a live intercept. Silence was not neutral. Silence would have been read as compliance until proven otherwise. The overrule, therefore, did not arrive as a shouted command or a last-minute directive. It was present in the expectations Curtis carried into the cockpit. He understood the consequences of refusal without needing them stated. Removal from flight status. Investigation. Court-martial. The quiet end of a career defined by adherence to rules he was now expected to violate only at his own peril. Alliance politics further narrowed the space for deviation. American pilots operating near the Soviet bloc were not merely defending airspace. They were representing resolve on behalf of multiple governments. Any perceived softness could strain alliances already sensitive to balance and hierarchy. Curtis' individual conscience had no weight against that collective calculation. The system did not consider itself cruel. It considered itself necessary. It assumed that the price of safety was consistency and that exceptions were dangerous because they invited interpretation. In that worldview, Curtis' recognition was not tragic. It was irrelevant noise. The final pressure came not from command voices, but from certainty. Curtis knew exactly what was expected. The clarity of expectation removed any illusion of freedom. The institution did not need to threaten him. It had already shaped him. When Curtis acted, he was not choosing between duty and emotion. That framing suggests an option that did not exist. The structure of authority, reinforced by political fear and institutional memory, had already resolved the question. The overrule was total, impersonal, and invisible. It did not shout. It did not argue. It simply left no alternative that the system would acknowledge as legitimate. By the time Curtis' finger tightened on the trigger, the decision had ceased to belong to him in any meaningful sense. The missile's launch resolved the engagement in seconds, but its consequences unfolded far beyond the narrow frame of the intercept. From a military standpoint, the outcome was immediate and unambiguous. The MiG reacted too late. Evasive maneuvers reduced options, but did not break the tracking solution. The aircraft was struck, its structure failing under forces it was never meant to absorb. Fire consumed the fuselage as it fell away from controlled airspace, leaving a brief scar of smoke across the pale sky. Ground radar confirmed the loss. Controllers logged the contact as neutralized. The corridor was secure again. Curtis did not follow the wreckage down. He was not required to. His next instructions arrived almost instantly. Resume patrol. Maintain altitude. Remain available for further tasking. The system moved forward without pause, indifferent to what had just occurred inside his cockpit. The radio traffic returned to routine cadence. Voices discussed fuel states, weather shifts, and potential secondary contacts. Nothing in the tone reflected deviation or shock. For command, the engagement had already ended. One line would be entered into a report, one that would disappear from aboard. Curtis' aircraft continued to fly normally. The engine maintained steady output. Instruments displayed no anomalies. From the outside, nothing distinguished this sortie from dozens before it. That normalcy was itself part of the consequence. The system required it. Any disruption would suggest failure, not tragedy. The personal consequence began immediately, but remained invisible. Curtis' hands did not shake while flying. Training prevented that. The discipline held. What fractured was internal, silent, and unrecorded. Recognition had occurred too late to alter the outcome and too early to be ignored. Memory, once activated, did not recede with altitude. Upon landing, the procedures continued as expected. Aircraft inspection, debrief, confirmation of kill. Curtis answered questions concisely. He did not volunteer information. He was not asked for any. The engagement required no explanation beyond technical parameters. Mission success was logged without embellishment. Commendation followed as routine consequence. Intercepts that ended cleanly were valued. They demonstrated readiness and resolve. Curtis' file reflected competence and reliability. There was no notation for hesitation because none was visible. There was no space for context because none was authorized. For the institution, the engagement reinforced doctrine. The rules had worked. A potential breach had been eliminated without escalation or loss on the friendly side. Deterrence had been maintained. The system judged itself correct by the absence of complications. Beyond the paperwork, the effect rippled outward in predictable ways. Soviet patrol behavior adjusted slightly in the following weeks, flight paths shifting but not disappearing. Each side noted the engagement as part of an ongoing pattern. No diplomatic protest followed. No public statement was issued. Silence signaled acceptance of the rules as they stood. The broader consequence was normalization. Encounters like this reinforced the idea that airspace was a lethal boundary, not a negotiable one. Pilots on both sides absorbed the lesson without commentary. Familiarity did not protect. Recognition did not exempt. The sky was governed by classifications, not relationships. For Curtis, the consequence was not immediate breakdown or visible descent. It was persistence. The memory did not fade because it was not processed. The system offered no mechanism for acknowledgement beyond operational language. Svetlana Valeria existed nowhere in Curtis reports. She existed only in recollection. Each subsequent intercept carried residue. Every radar contact invited an involuntary flash of association. Curtis did not fail. He continued to execute orders. The discipline held because it had to. The cost was cumulative, not catastrophic. The system remained unaware and uninterested. Curtis' performance metrics did not decline. His flight hours accumulated. Promotions remained possible. The institution read his career as uninterrupted. From its perspective, the engagement had produced only positive outcomes. The human consequence extended beyond Curtis alone. Svetlana's absence registered elsewhere, reduced to an operational loss within Soviet records. Another pilot failed to return. Another family received notice stripped of detail. The symmetry was unacknowledged. Each side recorded the loss in isolation, disconnected by ideology and bureaucracy. The engagement thus reinforced the central paradox of the Cold War air war. It was intensely personal at the point of execution and entirely impersonal at every level above it. Decisions made in distant rooms produced consequences borne by individuals who were neither consulted nor remembered once the outcome was logged. Nothing about the encounter altered policy. No review questioned the rules. No exception was considered. That absence of reaction was itself a consequence. The system learned nothing because it believed it had nothing to learn. Curtis continued to fly in the same skies, enforcing the same boundaries. The corridor remained frozen, hostile, and predictable. The rules that had compelled his action remained unchanged because they had functioned exactly as intended. In that sense, the consequence was not merely the loss of an aircraft or a life. It was the confirmation of a structure that required such losses to validate itself. The engagement proved that the system could compel action even when recognition intervened. That proof mattered more than the cost incurred to obtain it. The war in the air did not escalate that day. It did not de-escalate either. It simply continued, sustained by thousands of similar moments that never reached public awareness. Curtis' engagement became one more data point in a long ledger of enforcement. The tragedy lay not in deviation, but in conformity. The decision had been executed flawlessly. The outcome aligned perfectly with expectations. The consequence, measured by institutional standards, was success. Measured by any other standard, it was irreversible loss absorbed without acknowledgement, folded seamlessly into the routine of patrol schedules and after-action reports. That is how the system survived. The post-war record transformed the engagement from an event into a case file. Years later, when classifications loosened and archives opened incrementally, the incident surfaced only as a routine intercept within a broader pattern of Cold War air encounters. Declassified NATO documents described the engagement in precise, unemotional language. Time of contact, altitude, radar lock achieved, missile fired, target destroyed. The report concluded with a single evaluative sentence noting proper execution of standing orders. No annex, no commentary, no deviation flagged. Curtis' name appeared only as an identifier attached to a sortie number. His performance assessment for that period remained uniformly positive. Training officers cited his adherence to protocol as exemplary. There was no indication in official records that the engagement warranted further review. From the institution's perspective, nothing about the incident distinguished it from dozens of similar outcomes. Soviet archival material, released decades later, mirrored that reduction. The loss was catalogued as an operational casualty resulting from an airspace violation. Aircraft type: pilot listed as missing, later presumed killed. No mention of circumstance beyond hostile contact with NATO forces. The narrative ended there. Individual biography did not intrude into the record. Only in personal documents did the full shape of the event emerge. Curtis' private correspondence and later diary entries, never intended for publication, revealed a sustained psychological weight that official channels neither recognized nor addressed. He did not dispute the legality of his action. He did not question the order. What recurred was awareness. A fixed memory anchored to a specific altitude, a specific bearing, a specific marking on a fuselage. Those writings did not express outrage. They recorded resignation. Curtis described the encounter as inevitable once recognition occurred, not because of fate, but because of structure. He understood, even years later, that the outcome had been determined long before he entered the cockpit. That understanding did not relieve him of its burden. Military historians reviewing the incident placed it within a broader analysis of Cold War command culture. The engagement became an illustrative example in studies examining how rigid rules of engagement suppressed discretion to prevent escalation. The conclusion was consistent across analyses. The system functioned as designed. The human cost was acknowledged only as an abstract variable. Training manuals referencing similar cases emphasized technical lessons rather than ethical ones. They focused on identification discipline, lock-on procedures, and communication clarity. The emotional dimension was noted briefly, framed as a stress factor to be managed privately. No institutional reform followed. The Air War's logic remained unchanged. Curtis continued his career without interruption. Promotions came at expected intervals. Retirement arrived without ceremony. In official biographies, the engagement was not singled out. It blended into a list of missions flown, hours logged, duties fulfilled. The public record preserved a competent officer executing assigned tasks. The asymmetry between record and reality persisted. The institution remembered success. The individual remembered consequence. Neither record contradicted the other. They simply existed on different planes, never intersecting. With hindsight, the incident did not alter policy, doctrine, or strategy. It altered only one life in a way the system neither measured nor corrected. That limitation was not a failure of oversight. It was an accepted condition. The post-war record closes cleanly. The files align. The timelines match. The conclusions are unambiguous. The engagement stands as documented proof of how Cold War command structures operated when personal knowledge collided with standing orders. The documents show no anomaly because, by institutional definition, none occurred. History, as recorded, remains intact. The record is complete. Lewis Curtis did not act out of malice or impulse. He acted because the structure surrounding him permitted only one outcome. The decision was presented as personal, but it was never his to own. It had been predefined by doctrine, reinforced by political fear, and enforced through an institutional intolerance for exception. The system required certainty. It rewarded compliance. It could not accommodate recognition without undermining itself. Curtis' awareness did not alter the outcome because the framework governing his actions was designed to prevent alteration. In that sense, the engagement was not a failure of character or courage. It was a demonstration of how authority functions when discretion is treated as a liability. Svetlana Valeria was not targeted because of who she was. She was destroyed because of where she was and how the system classified her presence. Her identity mattered only long enough to be erased by procedure. Curtis' identity mattered only insofar as he fulfilled his role without deviation. No correction followed because none was required. The engagement reinforced the rules rather than exposing their limits. The absence of controversy confirmed the system's success. Deterrence held. Careers advanced. Records aligned. The cost was absorbed privately and recorded nowhere that mattered to command. That omission was not accidental. It was structural. Institutions that rely on obedience cannot afford to acknowledge the consequences of perfect compliance. This case does not end with outrage or reform. It ends with confirmation. The system functioned as intended. The individual endured what the system does not measure. Curtis is not remembered for the decision because, in institutional terms, no decision occurred. Svetlana is remembered only as a loss entry. The truth exists only in the gap between those two records. That gap is the final verdict. If you want to continue examining how command decisions quietly override military logic and human consequence, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment.